Good afternoon, welcome back. I will convene the 1:30 afternoon session of the Board of County Commissioners meeting for Tuesday, March 29th, 2022. And we start off this afternoon session. It's a very full session with some really meaty topics. And we start off with item 12 with Public Works and a discussion and presentation from staff about a community development block grant and disaster recovery fund. And we have a guest, so I will turn it over to our staff to prepare us for this item and introduce our guest.
Thank you, Vice Chair Trigger. Can you hear me okay? Great. Good afternoon, Vice Chair and Commissioners. For the public joining today, my name is Matt McCrae. I serve as the Disaster Recovery Manager for Lane County, supporting recovery from the Holiday Farm Fire. We have 30 minutes today for this item, so my comments will be very brief. I will not be providing an update on wildfire recovery today. I'll be back before the board in April for that purpose. Today's conversation is about priorities for the use of federal disaster recovery funds. This is the first board engagement with OHCS about the community development block grant funds. There will be another opportunity for the board to provide input once the OHCS action plan has been drafted. I would like to call your attention to one detail. The official count of the number of homes destroyed by the Holiday Farm Fire has been revised upward from 464 to 577. This is due to ground truthing and other data verification efforts that have improved our understanding. You will see these new numbers reflected in today's presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Alex Campbell. Alex serves as the Chief External Affairs Officer for the Recovery and Resilience section of Oregon Housing and Community Services. Prior to this role with OHCS, Alex worked as the Regional Solutions Coordinator for Southern Oregon, where he was deeply immersed in the wildfire recovery efforts in Jackson County. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alex.
Sorry, I was trying to find the right screen. Excuse me. Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, Chair and Commissioners. I appreciate the time and your attention, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. So I am going to, if I, looks like I have the ability to share my screen. It looks like I will bump off the agenda by doing so, but I assume that that's okay. And so I'm going to make sure that I share the right screen and jump into the presentation. So I'm going to cover the guiding principles that we as staff are looking to as we are developing an action plan for this community development block grant. I'll talk about the process and where we are on the timeline. I call it Action Plan 1.0 here because we will amend this action plan over the course of the grant. So the one way to think about what we're talking about today and over the next couple months is what aspects of the action plan we want to stand up first over the next year or two. I'll cover the basics of disaster recovery and a little bit about what we understand in terms of the match between the program requirements and the fire survivors, and talk in a little bit more depth about unmet needs. Unmet needs is HUD terminology for what we might spend the money on, and I'll talk a little bit about that calculation. They ask us to define unmet needs before we define the programs to address them.
Alex, I'm just going to interrupt very briefly. We're seeing your slide 15, and it's in the outline format, not the presenter's format.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. How's that?
Don't see any change.
Huh.
There we go. It's a slightly different format. Can you click on slide number 1? We're still seeing slide, I think it's slide 15.
Yeah. It's weird. I'm going to stop and start again.
Okay.
So, but I don't want to take up too much time messing around with this technology. So
the backup plan, if it's not working, Diana can often run the presentation from her desk.
sure. Let me just see if I can do this quickly. Get this to a PDF version, and then I will share that. I apologize. As Matt was saying, I am new to OHCS, so I am learning some new technology for me, slightly different versions of software, and think I'm almost there.
Alex, I can bring it up. This is Diana.
Okay, thanks. Yes, it did not. Did I already send it to you, or do I need to send it to you?
Is it the one you sent last week that I've linked to the agenda?
Yeah. Why don't you, let me try one more time, because I did reorder some of the slides a little bit. And that may, oh, if this opens, yes, I think I'm there. Okay. I will share my screen again and share the PDF version. All right. Right. Matt, am I there?
Yeah, it works. Yep, you're scrolling
Okay.
through. Yep.
Sorry about that. So when the OHCS staff has been thinking about what should we consider as our guiding principles, we're looking at the program rules from HUD. We are also looking at this as, from our agency perspective. The governor directed HUD to make this grant to Oregon Housing and Community Services to administer. We are also looking towards some work that my colleague Kim Travis led with the assistance from a whole lot of local stakeholders, developing a disaster housing recovery action plan, and also looking at the findings of the governor's Wildfire Economic Recovery Council that met in the aftermath of the 2020 Labor Day fires. The common themes from the applicable common themes from all of those documents jumped out pretty quickly. And they were to advance equity and racial justice. We know that fires, disasters in general, impact populations that have lower socioeconomic status on a lot of different axes. They impact them more. They are more likely to suffer. They are in less resilient financial situation to deal with that impact, and also have more trouble accessing assistance to recover. So we will focus on doing everything that we can to serve those populations. And that includes serving communities that have suffered less or received less investment in the past. We want to build back better. We want to be more resilient to future disasters. The HUD rules support that strongly, and we've heard a lot from our local communities that they want to see that as well. And finally, we believe that community recovery and housing recovery go hand to hand. You can't really have one meaningfully without the other. So where we are is in a sort of first stage of public engagement. In May, we'll have a formal public comment period as required by HUD, but we wanted to do some early engagement as well, to both let folks know what we're up to, but also to ask stakeholders, local governments, to help inform the first draft of the plan, particularly as we're thinking about the first decisions about resource allocation. So we are wrapping that up next week, the round one. We're going to be meeting with a couple members of the Housing Stability Council, and then also some local stakeholders. We've invited the Mackenzie Valley LTRG Executive Director to represent the long-term recovery groups. in that meeting. We're going to be presenting the findings of our first round of community engagement and presenting a first cut at the resource allocation, the budgeting decision. You know, obviously, budgeting decisions are often the most important policy decision that you make. So we want to make sure that we're on a good track on that, both in terms of the way the Housing Stability Council will look at the matter, and also as our local partners look at the recovery. From that point, we'll be able to write a draft action plan and publish that for public comment. During that, first couple weeks of public comment, we'll also be doing some smaller discussions, focusing more specifically on program design, with groups to sort of ground truth what we're thinking about. We'll also have some public town halls during that public comment period, and we'll submit an action plan to HUD in June, and hopefully have their approval to move into implementation in early fall. The basics of the grant are that there are $422 million available to the state to spend in the teal counties here. Obviously, that includes Lane County. The counties were the most impacted, clearly, from the 2020 wildfires. A key requirement of the grant is that at least 70% of the funds must be spent to the benefit of low to moderate income households. I'll give you those exact figures for Lane County on the next slide. A little bit different than most CDBG programs, the state can provide services directly under this grant. So our starting assumption is not that all of this money would be made as sub-grants to each of the 7 counties. In fact, we think that a lot of the program is probably to support individuals. And we think there is, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of record keeping. We think that it probably makes sense to centralize that to some extent, rather than asking each of the 7 counties to stand up their own individual program. We'd of course partner with local community-based organizations and others to do intake and to be the face of the program. But I just want to clarify that up front, that it is different than CDBG as you all usually work with it. We are required to spend at least 15% of the grant for mitigation. That can be in the form of the construction that we fund, for example. So as we're funding new housing, making sure that housing is resilient to other disasters, potential future disasters. It could also be in the form of standalone infrastructure investments or other investments that would make us more resilient to future disaster. Generally speaking, most of the program is responsive to wildfire. So the housing efforts, infrastructure, most of the infrastructure efforts would be responsive to the past wildfires. But in the case of mitigation, it's more forward-looking. So it doesn't have to be specific to wildfire. It could be to make us more resilient to any of the significant disaster risks that we face. The eligible activities is the full palette, really, of CDBG activities. Specifically, we can do program services to support disaster relief. A lot of different programs to support long-term recovery from disaster, whether that's rebuilding or building new infrastructure, new housing. We can support economic revitalization efforts, and of course, as I mentioned, mitigation of risk. So in Lane County, that the population that we must prioritize in servicing and will need to spend most of the money assisting are the bold figures here. So an individual earning up to about $40,000 a year, a 3-person household earning over $50,000 a year. Those are low to moderate income households per HUD's definition. And when we looked at the block groups, the census block groups of the area impacted by the Holiday Farm fire, which is unfortunately, I think, our best estimate today of the full population impacted by that fire, over a third would qualify at that low and moderate income standard. So we know that there are a lot of folks who really need our help and will be eligible for the bulk of these funds. And that is not to say that we can't spend some of these funds assisting folks with somewhat higher incomes. It's just to say that we need to spend at least 70% doing either programs to individuals that meet this income standard, or providing infrastructure to and that would have to be infrastructure that has a service area that has a majority of folks who meet this income standard. So as I said, it's really a two-step process, the action plan development. We're asked to do a needs assessment, and it's fairly straightforward. We're told to estimate what the total cost of recovery is, to subtract the resources that have already been made available, and the difference is the unmet need. And we do that in three different areas. We do that in terms of housing, we do that in terms of infrastructure, and we do that in terms of economic revitalization. And what I'm going to run through are the specific calculations that HUD requires us to start with. We can supplement these calculations with additional information, but HUD does require us to report these things specifically, and then we can make the case for additional things that we believe should be considered. So in housing, they ask us to look specifically at especially to the impacts to public housing, affordable housing, also the relative impacts to renters and owners. In the area of infrastructure, they ask us to look at the non-federal share of a couple specific FEMA programs. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail. And then in economic revitalization, they ask us to look at some statistics that the Small Business Administration generates when businesses apply to them for disaster assistance. And then
Alex, if I may interrupt just briefly, I know we got started just a little bit late. Chair Trieger, I'd just like to offer the opportunity to adjust if we need to. I know we have a half an hour budgeted for this time, but just want to.
That's right. Yeah, thanks for checking in on that. And we had it as a 10-minute presentation and 20 for discussion. But we really do have a really packed agenda. The rest of the afternoon is quite full. So
well,
I think we need the information to have a good discussion, but we are really tight on time.
Well, I appreciate that heads up. I think I can finish up what I'm doing here quite quickly.
Thanks, Alex.
So, thank you. So we look at the number of houses lost. We know that it's going to cost a heck of a lot to replace over 4,000 houses. We know that there are some resources, including insurance, available to help, but that there's a large amount of folks who either had no homeowners insurance or were significantly underinsured. So we know there's a huge unmet need in terms of housing. In terms of infrastructure, there's a significant unmet need, no matter how you look at it, and there are infrastructure needs that aren't even eligible for any of these programs. So that is one of the key things that I hope to hear from our local government partners. What are the infrastructure needs that you see that you haven't been able to identify assistance for? And then in terms of economic revitalization, again, the numbers that we have don't nearly encompass the full impact. And there haven't been a lot of resources made available here yet. And so if you think this is something that's important to tackle in the first year or two, that'd be really helpful to hear. So I'll stop there and welcome any clarification questions. I'll include in the chat, both for the benefit of the, public and commission members. We have a survey instrument. I'm losing my voice.
I see Commissioner Buck has a hand raised, and I'll just ask real quick too, if we didn't get to look at the slide with the housing, the number of homes and so on, and I was going to ask if that reflects the updated number that Matt gave us earlier or not. Okay.
We actually have an even slightly higher number than that. So, but it's certainly higher than the original number.
Okay, great. Thank you. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. And I've had the benefit of listening to this yesterday with the long-term recovery group at this presentation. And I have a number of questions that will probably exceed the time we have available today. So we'll follow up with that. But first, I want to thank our congressional members for bringing this kind of money home back to Oregon in order to help work on recovery throughout the state, especially here in Lane County. Part of my concern is that this program will be so specific, it won't actually have money available for other things that folks are really going to actually need. One of those is, we need staff in our land planning department. We have hired up for an additional 7 staff. We need funding for those people on an ongoing basis. Will this program be able to help fund those folks? And I don't know how you do that when you have an allocation of income requirement for the majority of these funds, but that is a big question I have. There has been conversation that in programs like this in the past, those that are eligible could not have already started building by the time that this program funding is made available. And we have a lot of people that have already started or in queue of starting building. And I want to make sure that they are all equally eligible. And in our area, unlike some of the other fire affected counties, we have mostly single family dwellings on stick-built, mobile, on fee simple land, and not a lot of opportunity for multifamily housing. We have a couple of mobile home parks, but nothing like where you are, Alex, down in Jackson. So we need to ensure that we have a portion of this funding being able to service the type of housing that we are allowed to actually build in that area, or maybe funding that can actually go towards efforts of helping rezone or address land use issues in order for people to be able to rebuild. And that's a statewide, issue. And the last item I wanted to talk about is we at Oregon Solutions, as we're working on recovery upriver, have been working in attempting to contact and have communications with our tribal communities. And what we're hearing is that even if we were able to resource a position for a tribal member to participate in our Oregon Solutions team or other recovery efforts upriver, they really don't have the capacity. They don't have the people, the bandwidth in order to be able to even offer somebody who would be able to help in that capacity. And that's a real need. I don't know if this funding can go towards that either. Thank you, Chair.
Any other comments from the board before I see if there's any response to that? Commissioner Burney.
Thank you, Chair. Alex, 422 million. How much is retained? How much is retained in sale? Could you?
So, would you like me to answer that, or should I answer
you
that?
Have an answer, yeah.
Yeah. So there is a maximum administrative cost to the grant, which is, it's a round number, and I'm forgetting whether it's 10 or 15%, but I can get that back to you exactly. So there is a maximum in terms of administrative expenses. The services, I think that's the answer to the question.
But that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's me, isn't it? Can you hear me now or no?
Yeah, it's a little quiet.
I have a concern for either the state or the feds imposing requirements that require them to play much of a role. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's going on in my to play much of a role. Is there any chance these could be like the old block grants, where on the basis of some criteria, the grants were provided directly to counties, and the counties in fact could give more dollars to people without restrictions? And forgive me.
So there is the possibility for local governments to be subrecipients on a formula basis that that we can figure out together. You would be subject to the same requirements that the state is, so it won't give us any more flexibility in terms of how to spend the money. But that certainly is a possible way that the program could be structured.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I don't know what's my mic. I apologize.
Okay, yeah, it looks like you're logged on twice somehow, but maybe if you want to message with Diana offline, maybe we can patch you in for audio via phone the way we did this morning. Are there any other comments from the board before I ask if staff wants to respond to any of Commissioner Buck's comments? Matt, Alex, do you have any response to the earlier comments from Commissioner Buck?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of assistance with short-term planning staff, that's something I'm going to have to check. I think in terms of it supporting housing development, I suspect that there may be a route there. In terms of the planning issue that you mentioned last, that certainly is an eligible expense. There is a cap that no more than 5% of the whole grant can be expended on planning activities, but that would be a type of planning, land use planning, long-term land use planning clearly would be an eligible expense. I would also just highlight that the state did make another $2 million available for the municipal wildfire assistance program in the short session, so that can in the near future assist the county with those planning expenses. You are correct that there are some challenges, regulatory challenges and others, to assisting folks who have already started construction. We are certainly interested in figuring out every way we can to work through those. The state is currently already contracting with a firm to carry out environmental review at a very high level, which is one of the requirements. And my understanding is most states have figured out a way to address that situation, but it can be difficult and it can be awkward. And you're right, it's a challenge with the way the rules are written. We certainly understand that the recovery for the Holiday Farm fire cannot take place with a lot of multifamily development, and will even in the cases of rental, replacing rental housing, that needs to take place in smaller formats. So absolutely, we're looking at that as we're developing programs, and would certainly be interested to hear any suggestions about how we could assist with tribal outreach. I mean, those kinds of services, particularly when we're providing services to individuals to help them access our programs, are clearly places that we need to spend money. If we want these programs to be available to those who need them most, we need to invest the resources to make that possible. And tribal outreach, I suspect strongly could be that kind of activity. So I appreciate your questions.
Great, thank you. I think as we wrap this up, I'll just appreciate the summary in the staff memo, the bulleted list, but one of the things on it that it doesn't sound like this funding is an eligible use for this funding is addressing the behavioral health needs and social supports that survivors at the individual household and community level will need. And so, if that's just simply not what this funding is for, that's, noted, but I didn't know if you had any comments about basically the health and stability of the people living in the houses that the dollars are going to helping rebuild.
It is not categorically excluded. I think there are, I'll have to get back to you on exactly what we could assist with. I know that we could assist with folks who have impacts from the fire that they're dealing with. In terms of their behavioral or emotional or mental health, but exactly where that line is something that I have to get back to you on.
Great, thank you. Well, I know we kind of whipped through your presentation quickly, and so we saw the timeline. It's pretty short, and so we'll leave it to Matt, I would think, to let us know when or if is the right time to hear back on progress of these funds in particular, and what the right next steps are. Are there any other questions from the board before I turn it back to staff to wrap up this item? Seeing none. Matt?
Thank you, Chair Trieger and commissioners, for your input. I will circle back with you at the next opportunity to provide feedback. Thank you.
If I could say one thing briefly, and that is, if there are members of the public who are listening that would like to share their input, the survey is available on our website. The easiest way to find that is to just type CDBG-DR Oregon into your search browser, and that'll take you to, the first hit there will be the state's website, and there's a survey there to so you can share your priorities with us.
Great, thank you very much, Alex and Matt.
Thanks, Alex.
Recording in progress.
All right. Moving on to item 13, County Administration for a discussion in the matter of allocating American Rescue Plan Act dollars. And I know we have Robert Tintle with us, but Steve Mokohiski, yeah, here you are. Great. I'll turn it over to you to introduce the item and get us going with staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Robert is going to take this item. Know that commissioners, we've had several conversations at our board meetings during several updates on this item, and Robert and our team have done a significant amount of work to pull together the recommendations that are here for the board. So I'll turn it over to Robert to walk through that, and then certainly here to answer any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thank you. Excuse me, my apologies. Really quick before we go on, Commissioner Burney, do you want to just say a quick hello, and let's make sure you're set up with audio so that we can troubleshoot that during the presentation if need to?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, we hear several of you. It's very echoey, but we hear you.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to try and get out of here and come back.
Great.
Carry on with the meeting.
Okay. Thank you. Pardon that interruption. Robert, go ahead. Thanks.
No problem. Chair Trieger, commissioners, thank you for another opportunity to come before you today. We are talking about an update and discussion on the results of our community-wide survey, which collected public input on the American Rescue Plan project areas and priorities. The board is also being asked to allocate funding to additional projects and services from the second payment of ARPA that we will be expecting in May of this year. And I will be presenting along with Alex Dreer today. We also have Austin Ramirez joining us, Dan Hurley, and Alex Kyler will be joining in parts of the presentation as well. A quick review for those who may be listening that might not have seen some of these presentations before, but the American Rescue Plan Act did cover many areas of focus to individuals, businesses, schools, health, and state and local assistance. Today, we are talking about the funding that was provided to cities and counties. Specifically for the American Rescue Plan Act, the fiscal recovery funds, it's the portion of this pie here of $350 billion that is provided to counties and cities across the US. It's just one piece of the American Rescue Plan. This is just another way of presenting it. There was already funding for tax credits for families, FEMA disaster relief, rental assistance to restaurants and bars, veterans, and other areas, as you can see here, along with direct family assistance of $1,400 payments. As a review, the US Treasury did provide guidance on eligible uses of funds into 4 categories they labeled A, B, C, and D. First of all, A, it was to support the public health response and the negative economic impacts. Secondly, paid for essential workers. C, replace lost public sector revenues. And D, infrastructure areas, water, sewer, and broadband. They further classified all of the expenditure categories into 7 main areas: public health, negative economic impacts, services to disproportionately impacted communities, the premium pay, infrastructure, revenue replacement, and admin. And when we did our survey, we wanted to make sure we aligned with Treasury US eligible categories and uses. Also, the Treasury was very specific on ineligible uses. We cannot use funds to put in pension fund deposits. You just can't set funds aside in rainy day funds or financial reserves. There has to be a purpose for them, which we have. General infrastructure, just in general, can't be used, but you have to follow exact guidelines, except for water, sewer, and broadband, unless you're using another category, such as provision of government services, which we are as well. And finally, debt service and legal settlements, can't use funds in those areas. A reminder of what got us here to where we are today. We got our first payment back in May of 2021. We went through processes with the board to adopt guiding principles and priorities. A steering committee was created. In October, we developed a matrix for allocating our first tranche of fundings. And we came to the board in December of 21, and we actually allocated 55 million of our projects already. And this is what gets us to our, of our expected 74 million in rounded numbers of the fiscal recovery funds from the American Rescue Plan. 55 million, as I mentioned, was allocated in December of 2014 by the Board of County Commissioners to a list of projects. We'll briefly highlight those. 4 million has also been set aside for unanticipated costs as a contingency as we continue to respond to the pandemic and the recovery essence of the pandemic. That leaves $15 million to be allocated, and that's what we're presenting today and talking about today. As a reminder, when the board met in December, of the 55 million, about 10 million was dedicated to fiscal stability and the financial stability of the county. Those funding sources went to provide the replacement of lost revenue that had impacted the county. The second tier of projects that the Board of County Commissioners approved back in December was about 8.5 million, and those are for ongoing costs related to the COVID-19 pandemic at that time, and also costs to support the capacity demands upon the organization in continuing response to that recovery. Finally, the board made a lot of decisions around what to include from the third tier of projects, and about $37 million was allocated for a number of projects in that third tier of projects, including what was called at the time the Behavioral Health Crisis Center of $7 million, adult corrections, provider network capacity, shelter and navigation services, and the list that you see here. Detailed lists are also included in the agenda packet as well for further and future reference. Finally, in summary here with this part is in total between our 55 million allocation, we also received ARPA funding for for rental assistance and energy assistance. And also we were allocated $13 million through House Bill 5006 that we've already allocated funding out. And that is $100 million that has flowed through Lane County in these areas here between housing, homelessness, aid to nonprofits, public health, public safety, essential government services, and infrastructure. And within your packet, you'll see the detail of all the projects that we've allocated to that. And those are in the appendix attachments within the board packet today. Additionally, if we look at just beyond Lane County as an organization, but what has our region received in Lane County from ARPA funding? And you can see it's about $160 million. And attachment D, appendix D in the board packet, also highlighted what each of the organizations are spending their funding on. City of Eugene obviously had the highest amount of funding at 36 million, followed by City of Springfield at 14 million. There are a lot of organizations, especially the smaller ones. Not all the funding has been allocated yet. They're still keeping some aside, going to make some future additions. But again, the details also contained in your attachments to the board packet.
So just, excuse me, just to be clear, that slide you just showed is what they've allocated, not what they've received for allocation.
That's what they've received. Most have, at least some have been allocated by each of these organizations. Some are at different stages. So not all has been spent, but that's approximate their allocation.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying. Next, we're going to talk about the community input survey. So as we started researching and getting community input, it came through various sources. The ARPA survey was just one data point and one means of getting and gathering community input. We also, as you are all aware, received input through the strategic planning process that also was in alignment with what we were hearing from the ARPA survey. Also some national statistics as well regarding mental health, public services that we'll hear about too. Finally, we've also received a lot of community input through direct inquiries, and those would be through emails or conversations directly through various either commissioners or department heads or programs within Lane County that also had direct inquiries on funding allocations from the American Rescue Plan. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Dreer, and she'll provide a summary of our public engagement process.
Thank you, Robert. Chair Trieger. The survey was open for 21 days in February and received over 1,800 responses. The American Rescue Plan website was the 27th most viewed Lane County website in February 2022. Community input was also sought from a gathering of community-based organizations and nonprofits that was organized by Lane County Public Health staff. Respondents were asked to rank 5 key areas of focus in order of importance. These overarching focus areas reflect the U.S. Treasury's allowed use of funds. We will cover the detailed project types within each focus area in the next few slides. Respondents, Robert, if you can go back, you're a little fast for me. Respondents favored public health, which includes mental health and substance use treatment, highest. They ranked services for disproportionately impacted communities as a close second, and that category includes housing, homelessness, and support for early childhood environments. Solidly in the middle was address negative economic impacts, which includes things like food, rent, and employment assistance. Infrastructure ranked 4th, that includes water, sewer, broadband, and government services were ranked lowest overall. These overarching focus areas again reflect the eligible expenditure categories. Public health was ranked as the most important focus area overall. Within public health, respondents ranked mental health services as the most important, followed by COVID vaccination, testing, contact tracing. And a close third was preventing COVID in congregate settings such as schools and jails. Community-based organizations also expressed concern about the level of trauma that the pandemic has inflicted on a large groups of the community, and a preponderance of comments advocated for mental health services specifically for youth. Next slide. One such comment said, "The impact of the pandemic on our young citizens will be felt for generations. It is imperative that we address their social and emotional needs in a way that is inclusive and responsive." Services to disproportionately impacted communities was ranked 2nd highest of all areas of focus. Within this focus area, affordable housing development ranked highest, with education assistance and support for early childhood environments, this includes childcare, coming in a close 2nd and 3rd. Many comments noted a need for affordable housing development and services for people experiencing homelessness, including mental health and substance use treatment. Comments also noted the needs of K through 12 school children who have been negatively impacted by school closures due to COVID. Many comments advocated for increased mental health support for youth, as well as childcare assistance for families to return to the workforce. This quote is from a nonprofit service provider collected during the public health community input session. This person works for a nonprofit, and they said, it's hard to think of anything that should be prioritized other than unhoused folks. That's the biggest challenge we're dealing with since COVID. There are other things I would love to see, but I feel like that is such an unmet gap that it's hard to want to prioritize anything else. Negative economic impacts was the third highest ranked area of focus, or also solidly in the middle. Survey respondents advocated for direct aid to community members, such as rent assistance, help paying bills in general, and other direct supports to help people who've been economically impacted by the pandemic. Comments also expressed a need for nonprofit and small business investments to spur community recovery and economic development. Many comments focused, next slide. Many comments focused on supporting small businesses that have closed during the pandemic. One comment said, support businesses, especially small businesses. You should be supporting those entities that generate and support economic vitality in the community. Then we have infrastructure, which ranked 4th out of the 5 areas of focus. Water projects ranked the highest within infrastructure. In fact, many survey comments expressed a need for water infrastructure and broadband projects in rural Lane County outside of Eugene Springfield. Next slide. One respondent commented, as someone who lives near Cresswell, our options for broadband are low. This makes it hard for online learning for kids and for working from home. I also believe that families are still affected as they have to pay for daycare to miss work when kids are being asked to stay home. And lastly, of all the focus areas, government services ranked lowest. Eligible American Rescue Plan expenses related to provision of government services is a very broad category. So the survey only asked people to rank the importance of cybersecurity, facility upgrades, and electric vehicle charging stations, just to name a few of the options. Facility upgrades ranked highest, with cybersecurity coming in a close second and electric fleet vehicle charging stations being the least favored. One respondent commented, next slide, it would be great to see some of that money going towards improving green spaces or ways people can gather outdoors. Increase outdoor covered areas at Lane County parks so people have safer gathering places for all the social things we can't stand to keep putting off. Next slide. So in summation, the top comments, the survey had 2 areas for open-ended comments, and input focused on the following topics: affordable housing development, homelessness, mental health services, especially for youth, direct aid to residents, parks, water infrastructure in rural Lane County, and broadband infrastructure in rural Lane County. The demographic questions for the survey were all voluntary because we wanted to prioritize getting feedback over who is actually taking the survey. Respondents were overwhelmingly white. There was decent geographic distribution of community members, with the majority residing in Eugene Springfield. However, almost 100 respondents were from Florence, 92 from Cottage Grove, and many residents from other small cities. Many respondents did not choose to answer. And most people said they heard about the survey through social media. 200 respondents said they worked for a nonprofit. 12% said they worked for a government organization. The age distribution of respondents was moderately evenly distributed among those 35 and older, and over 60% of community respondents identified as female. Based on the community input gathered from the survey, the allocations already designated by the county commissioners reflect the needs of the community, in particular the highest need for mental health services. The Respite and Stabilization Center, also referred to as the Behavioral Health Crisis Center, has been allocated $7 million in American Rescue Plan funds. And public health response was allocated 1.1 million, which includes projects like the South Lane Community Health Center and Dental Clinic in Cottage Grove, and a public health equity and resiliency project. Attachment C in your board packet gives a breakdown of the 20.5 million American Rescue Plan dollars invested in housing projects. This includes projects implemented by nonprofits, including Square One Villages, St. Vincent de Paul, and Homes for Good. This also includes the 11.5 million in rent assistance and 5.2 million for utility, weatherization, and water assistance. Direct food aid ranked high, and while there are no American Rescue Plan projects specifically funding food, one of Lane County's state ARPA funded projects is the Food for Lane County warehouse expansion, which will increase the food bank's capacity to store and distribute healthy perishable food to the community. Water infrastructure rose to the top as a need, especially in rural Lane County, and Lane County was awarded a 15.5 million grant, American Rescue Plan funded grant from the Oregon Business Development Division for McKenzie River Valley. Next slide.
Thank you, Alex, for the presentation. Before we move into the next area, I do want to say we have a few people joining us to talk about, there are proposed projects that we have for the remaining $15 million that the county has unallocated at this point, based on the community feedback and community input we received through the various mechanisms. We are proposing 5 projects to put forward for the consideration by the Board of County Commissioners. And we're going to talk about each of those quickly individually here. First one will be with Austin Ramirez Economic Development of $722,000, followed by a Parks, Water, and Sewer project that I believe Dan Hurley hopefully is on the line here, and a grant administration software, our community grant making process, followed by the Holiday Farm Fire Permit Services. We'll speak to each one of these. And I will first turn it over to Austin Ramirez. Thank you, Austin.
Thank you, Robert and Alex, and good afternoon, Vice Chair Trieger and Commissioners. I'm going to give a very brief overview of this slide, but I will be available following the presentation for any questions. The 4 investments before you address pre-existing economic issues that were exacerbated by COVID-19, but they also improve our economic recovery and resilience as we look ahead and look forward. They do that by primarily focusing on technical assistance for historically underserved businesses and those that we know were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, as well as strengthening our local CTE construction trades programs. So the WHERETO and OMET programs have been piloted over the past year. We've seen great success. This investment would greatly expand both programs and serve any eligible business throughout all of Lane County. We're also a longtime funder of RAIN, as you know, have seen their huge impact on rural Lane County. This new investment would expand their services into 9 rural cities in Lane County, as well as the entire 50-mile corridor of the McKenzie River Valley. So we would be helping businesses impacted by the pandemic and the wildfire. 4th project with Lane Workforce Partnership will ensure that high school youth in our school districts can realize opportunities to enter skilled trades, make living wages, and pursue those career paths outside of the traditional 4-year degree, which we know can be great and lead to prosperity. It's also important to note all of these investments will leverage an equal amount of additional public and private dollars, which is something we're always looking to achieve, and also allow these nonprofit organizations to focus on service delivery over the next several years, rather than the constant cycle of fundraising to deliver these programs. So these are proven evidence-based recommendations that truly support equitable economic opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions after the presentation. I'll be around for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. And Dan Hurley will speak to the Parks and Water Sewer project at $4.2 million.
Thanks, Robert. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I very much appreciate the committee elevating this project for your attention and consideration today. This project would be the first public works project that would be funded. There are a few public works divisions that received funds for revenue loss through ARPA, but this would be the first project. And this is a very important project, the highest priority project from our most underfunded division in public works, our Parks division. This is a critical project because the infrastructure at 4 of our largest parks, Richardson, Orchard Point, Baker Bay, and Armitage, are approaching end of life. Actually, they're past their engineered lifespan. Our water and wastewater collection systems and distribution systems are literally crumbling. These are made with antiquated pipes that are just falling apart. And so with the wastewater collection systems, that's probably causing discharges into groundwater. The systems are so dispersed, it's hard to tell where that might be coming from, but we know there are major problems in those systems at all 4 of the parks. And then in the water distribution side, we're seeing that evidenced because our pumps can't keep up. It's just a leaking sieve out there at Richardson and Orchard Point, to the point where we weren't able to supply water last summer. We didn't have sufficient water storage and distribution capability. So we had to close our parks and our restroom facilities at the parks and put in portable toilets. So this is a situation that needs to be addressed urgently. Parks doesn't have the funding for this. So if it's possible to fund out of ARPA, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
The next one is a countywide grant administration software, $450,000. I should mention Dan's previous project, this project, and the next project. These 2 projects were also included previously in the list of the unfunded needs that were identified. These aren't new ones. They just had risen to the top since the last time we've met. This project specifically, as we are processing more grants than we ever have countywide, it's also a realization that the county does not have a centralized grant tracking software that would utilize a software to increase efficiencies and really streamline our grant making process with the full life cycle across the organization. So this really is considered a legacy project for countywide, for the effective management of all of our grants that we've even increased more. And this would benefit all the departments, especially our largest departments that utilize grants on a regular basis. And next, Alex will speak to the community grant making process proposal.
The 4th recommendation is to set aside American Rescue Plan funds for community grants. A significant number of requests have been received by staff and commissioners requesting American Rescue Plan funds for various community projects. A grant making process would serve as an additional layer of community input. The ARP scoring matrix, which was used to rank internal Lane County projects, could be refined as a scoring tool for grant applications. Staff want to hear commissioner priorities for ARP grant funded projects. Some examples could be mental health services, especially for youth, projects that have a funding gap and leverage other funding sources, or a rural dedication, which has been the recent practice of community and economic development grants.
And finally, Dan Hurley on this item.
I'm sorry, I wasn't aware I was going to brief this.
Oh.
Robert, you're muted.
Sure.
Yep, click the wrong button. Thank you. So this is a result of, this item was presented at the Finance and Audit Committee recently about the need and the gap in the land management division of funding their services due to the Holiday Farm fire. It was recommended, a motion was put forward at the Finance and Audit Committee to include this item, $1.5 million request into the ARPA request to help stabilize the division due to the lost revenue that was brought as a result of the Holiday Farm fire. Total projected financial impact was $5.6 million. This is just one piece of the funding to help stabilize that division a little more.
Thanks, Robert.
And those are the five projects that are proposed, open for consideration and discussion, obviously by the board. Any other items that are brought forward by the board. First, now I want to turn to Alex Kyler for a brief legislative update of some recent funding sources that may be on the table as well. Alex.
Thank you, Robert. And Vice Chair Trieger and Commissioners, Alex Kyler, Lane County's Intergovernmental Relations Manager. In terms of the ARPA funding question in front of you today, I think the most important thing that I can tell you is, as we expected and have seen over really the last 2 years, there's just been an enormous amount of funding that we've had opportunities to seek and have been appropriated or awarded through granting opportunities. And in fact, the item immediately prior to this presentation, I think, was a great example of that, where our federal delegation secured a very large sum of money, a sort of a unique sum of money for disaster recovery activities, and we're now just getting to be able to see the potential for those dollars. And so my role today is just to highlight that given some of these new funding sources, we may want to explore how to ensure that we're preserving ARPA dollars in the best way possible. The ARPA dollars are very flexible for us, and it may be that some of these new dollars that are coming in have the opportunity to replace some of the ARPA related dollars. So I'm not suggesting any changes at the moment, absolutely not, but I think as we see, for example, this CDBG-DR money evolve, it may give us an opportunity to make some recommendations to the board to shift some of the ARPA priorities into that kind of bucket. I think the $1.5 million for permit support may be an opportunity there, for example. I'm not recommending that you do anything different today in terms of our recommendation, but it's an example of how we might be able to shift some funding in the future to preserve the ARPA dollars as much as possible. We're continuing to see, in fact, just about an hour ago, I got a grants update from our federal lobbying team with President Biden signing the FY22 budget about 3 weeks ago now. The grant dollars are really starting to flow. And so there's just these kinds of opportunities that we're trying to make sure that staff is taking full advantage of, and may allow us to come back to you in a future round of discussions about ARPA dollars and how to make sure we preserve these for as long as possible. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
And actually, that brings us to the end of our final presentation. There was a lot of information in here, but we wanted to be able to provide you the best information that we had available at this time. I think the point is there is still time for prudence and caution and effective management of these funds, and we're continuing to do that and dedicated to do that. Just a reminder, Chair, before I turn it back over, is there is a motion on the table and an order for an approval of American Rescue Plan projects to allocate funding to those projects as considered and as amended by the board, however the discussion may go. And if we do continue to move forward with the community grant making process, we'd love to hear feedback on your ideas and how we should solicit that information as well, if there's any criteria for that. And with that, we are done. Thank you for enduring the presentation today. And Chair Trieger, turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Enduring the presentation. It was terrific. Thank you. Really good information and really important and a lot to think about. And I do have some thoughts, but I want to turn it over to the rest of the board first for input and comment before I share my thoughts and a specific proposal around what's in the order at this time. So board, I'll open it up to you for comments, questions. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you. I'll start off the questions. So in the last comment from Alex Kyler, in seeking, still we're trying to seek other buckets of money for various items. I think that we've already previously allocated, and then the ones here in front of us today. So I am hopeful that when we have a future meeting about this allocation, that maybe some of the money we've already allocated may come back into the pot because we have found other funding in order to pay for that, because these ARPA funds are just so much more easy to utilize across various items that we know we need to fund and have less ties to them than what we traditionally see as federal or state funding coming our way. So I hope that will happen. I look forward to that actually happening. How soon, I don't think we'll know yet. We do know that there's a lot of funding coming through Oregon Housing Community Services for housing needs as well. And that may or may not impact what we've allocated or what maybe even the cities have allocated who had direct funding allocations in general. I support what's here and what you've presented. I'm thrilled to see economic development dollars going into our plethora of programs to fund. I'm also thrilled to see a grant program because that can just be leveraged in so many ways across all of our departments seeking other funds. And I appreciate having the $1.5 million for the Holiday Farm fire victims. We do have probably another very significant conversation to discuss on how we're going to fund our planning department. But in that particular discussion that we had at the Finance and Audit Committee meeting, where we discussed the gap in funding for that particular division, there are two different conversations going on, at least as I've thought about it. Ongoing operational dollars for the 7 additional staff we put in order to accommodate the increase in permits for those rebuilding upriver, and also the funding for the permit waivers that we've already approved as a board and how we're going to pay for that. As you can see from the presentation, that adds up to the tune of $5.6 million. We've only been allocated about $750,000 from the state to go towards that. So we have a significant gap. And from what I have been presented with, about 1.5 million of that gap is what it will cost to make sure that we can continue the fee waiver program for those rebuilding upriver. And so that's how the $1.5 million discussion became added to this list. We still have ongoing discussions about the operational costs of the additional staffing that we'll have to address eventually. Thank you.
Commissioner Burney.
Thank you, Chair. Fingers crossed, no reverberation. Okay. That's a lot of stuff. It's an awful lot to digest. So I'm just going to limit my remarks to a couple. Austin, Lane Workforce Partnership, isn't the Lane Workforce Partnership getting a big piece of the 200 million that the governor announced? And isn't that more than enough to cover this particular support that you've mentioned in item number 2, or no?
That the 200 million, I'm not sure what exactly their portion will be yet, but those funds will be used for a completely different set of services and programs. This grant effort.
You're saying those funds, cannot be used for this purpose?
Correct, they cannot be. Okay. So this project with Lane ESD, Lane Workforce Partnership, and potentially us, Lane County, we'd be filling the gap for a grant Lane ESD received, which covers 50%. So that leaves this 50% gap that hasn't yet been filled by any other funding sources.
Got it. My only comment is, and Mr. Moker-Heisey, you can comment if you want, but I remember back last year when these dollars were coming in, and I was involved much more with you in this process. One of the things that we talked about was creating, as you have, a structure that Mr. Tintle will be leading that could not only manage the high level of dollars through American Rescue Plan and infrastructure and other dollars, but also could serve as a liaison with many community groups, so that as there were other dollars to compete for or to request allocation to our county to capitalize, we would have a structure in place to do that. So what I want to say here is the $3 million for community partnerships is nice. That's a start. I would suggest using that as a beta, really, process to make sure that your structure, Mr. Tintle, can accommodate a much more aggressive acquisition of capital from federal and state sources for community groups in the county, and that those partnerships, in fact, are part of a whole system, whether it's workforce, whether it's economic development, whether it's housing, whatever it's for. So I really just want to asterisk that aspect of something I feel and felt very strongly about. So not questioning any of this, happy the 3 million is there, but that's a beta for what I think we can do to really mobilize resources for groups in Lane County moving forward. That's all I wanted to say at this time, Chair. Thank you.
Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you, Chair. First, I just want to say that the American Rescue Plan and multiple other congressional spending bills, including the infrastructure bill and prior stimulus, have created a tax on the American public in the form of inflation through the growth of the money supply that we've never seen in 40 years. So understanding that the American public is paying for this, I just want to remind people this isn't like free money. It's not, coming to us from some largesse out of nowhere. We are paying for these programs. So I take this distribution very seriously. And as I look at the overall survey work and what we got back versus what's being proposed, there's a mismatch to me somewhat. Public health was the #1 response from folks, and I have trouble putting any of those projects under public health. I will say I strongly support the parks request. I do think that I can almost stick that in under public health because people getting out in our parks is important for their health. It does fit the infrastructure, which at least scored better than government services. And it also addresses the negative economic impact as our parks revenues suffered severely during the pandemic because of the complete shutdown of the car rental industry due to the, basically shutdown of the travel industry. So that one to me jumps out as something I easily support. The Holiday Farm permit services, it's a great need, but that is government services. It scored the lowest from the public. So to me, there's a mismatch between what we're hearing from the public and there's the community development block grant program, which I don't know if like Commissioner Buck was mentioning earlier, may not fit our ability to get block grant money to backfill that additional cost. But that's, just generalized comments wise, I'm seeing kind of a mismatch between what the public told us they wanted to have this part of the money spent on. And we didn't set aside as much as Commissioner Burney originally asked us to set aside for the public to have comment on how we distributed the funds. And now we're not even, to me, listening to what the public had to say in some ways. So I just, as a generalized comment, I kind of wonder where the public health portion of this is. And I just, want to, see where that is. Now, we might address that under the community grant making process. Maybe that gets a higher score if it relates to public health. But I just, I kind of feel like we set this money aside out of the other, the direct allocation done by the board to get community input. We got community input, and now we're proposing 5 uses that don't match the priorities of that community input. And, as much as our country is paying for this funding and inflation and other detrimental impacts to our economy, we need to take this very seriously. So either this was a community directed funding or this is a board directed funding. And if we move ahead with the way it's proposed right now, to me, it's board directed.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just scrolling through my materials here. As I'm not completely sure, Commissioner Vozovich, if your concerns about the amount going to public health is reflected just in what we're talking about today, but I know in total of all the things that we've allocated dollars to, there's been, I want to say it's close to 9 million in public health. But what I would also say is, I think the general public's definition or understanding of public health and what our specific definitions are sort of internally might be different. In other words, I think that the general public has a more expansive and inclusive. So housing and addressing homelessness services are public health. Making sure that the wastewater and the water lines in the parks aren't contaminating the groundwater is public health. So in many ways, you could look at actually the majority of what we've allocated, aid to nonprofits, depending on what programs and services they're providing with those dollars, are public health. So I appreciate that concern. I don't feel it's as wildly out of balance as you may be, and I'm also not clear whether you're talking about the sum total of our allocations or this particular proposal for the 10 of the remaining 15 million. I also had some questions about the survey, whether the general public understood it was helping us make sure we were still on the right track with what we'd already identified versus a sort of more wide open, what would the community want to spend the money on? We may learn more about that if we move forward with the community grants program, which I see Commissioner Buck's hand up, so I want to get to her before I come back to a specific proposal or thought I have about moving forward on these 5 items and the 10 of the remaining 15 million. So Commissioner Buck.
Thank you. I just want to clarify that regarding the 1.5 million for the Holiday Farm fire, in my mind, that is specific to housing. It's all about building housing and recovering an entire community. It is not what I would consider government services. This is what we have to do in order to assist folks to build more housing in our community. That is the #1 issue that we're working on. So I just wanted to clarify my position on and how I view that particular item.
Thank you. So what I see here, because what we have before us is a discussion about a proposal for spending 10 of the remaining 15 million through these 5 programs that we have in front of us. And the first thing I want to say is I'm fully supportive of the $5 million set aside. I think as we've seen in a little less than a year since this money first started to flow in, how dynamic it's been. We also have just heard today, as has been mentioned, both from OHCS and then from Alex, that there's other funding sources that we're anticipating coming, money being moved around and made available for other projects. So I think it's really important that we put that aside and, as I think Alex mentioned, recognize the flexibility of these dollars and the need to preserve as many of them for the short term as possible till the bigger picture is a little more sorted out. And to give time for those other funding sources to become clearer. So fully in support of that. We also have, as I have been considering over these last several months since the first round of conversations around this, there's so much community need out there and not enough resource, even though this feels like such a flush influx of dollars, there's still so much need. And we as an organization, our responsibility as a board to ensure the financial stability and security of this organization is job 1, so that this organization is stable, so we can support other community projects and other community needs. So I love the concept of a community grants program. For me in this round, and as of today, it is the least urgent that we move forward on today. So personally, what I would be in support of doing is moving forward with the 4 of the 5 and setting aside the community grants program money to potentially revisit at another time when we've given a little more time to see what some other funding sources are, because we may be able to put more money into it if we can backfill some other allocations with other monies. I also just don't think it's kind of ready for prime time. There's a lot of questions that we still need to answer for staff around how it would be structured and the criteria and parameters for how it would go out, what the scoring, the grading would be, who would do that, and so on. So for me, moving forward on this item, I would advocate we move forward on the 4 of the 5. We set aside the community grants program dollars temporarily. But before we do that, you all got email from Dan Bryant, Executive Director of Square One Villages and the Peace Village Project, and Commissioner Farr, who couldn't be here today, sent us a message seeking specific support. So I would also have a specific request that we add in some support for that project. And for those of you that don't know or haven't had a chance to read about it, to me, the reason this one project in particular is so important is, first and foremost, it addresses that top issue of housing that we as a board and that the community tells us is their top issue. But 2, it does it in a really innovative and unique way that builds equity and capital for the folks who are living there. It's not permanent supportive housing. It really is just a stabilization and a buy-in and a real community model. It's innovative, it's transformative, it's a one-time expense. It's all the things that we've identified and in our top area of need. The funding model for that program in particular is there's a buy-in for the residents of $5,000 a household, and it's going to be 70 households. So there's a $350,000 piece of their $13.5 million project that the residents themselves are meeting. And I would love to see us at minimum match that, or perhaps even be able to go up to $500,000 for that project. It'll really help them leverage the remaining to close their, what is a $1 million gap. So in short, my proposal is $500,000 to the Peace Village project of the community grants program money. The remainder of that gets set aside for now for us to revisit when some of the other funding sources have come clearer to us. And I believe Commissioner Burney was first and then Commissioner Bozovich.
No, actually, I was second. That's okay. Thanks, Chair. You want me to go first? Okay. In response to that, I'm not prepared on this agenda item to talk about anything that's in this item and make a motion and approve something new. I would just like to state, even though it's few and far between that the chair and I disagree, I think the community grant program is probably the most important. And I think that it's going to provide the opportunity to be even more responsive to community input than I see this as. So that's just my 2 cents on that. I did also want to dive a little into the weeds, which I know as a board we're not supposed to, but just take youth mental health. I'd be very interested to know the kinds of programs that staff are looking at funding in that regard, because I think I don't have a clinical view of youth mental health. I have more of a social view. And I think there are things like cutting trails, doing Northwest Youth Corps type of stuff, getting involved in community, whether that's churches, sports, what have you, various projects where you're interacting with community people. Oftentimes in those activities, people that are the poorest have the least ability to support their kids doing that. So on the one hand, I want to say I think the community grant thing is one of the more important aspects of this. And on the other, I want to say that I'm very eager to understand what we're looking at when we talk about mental health services for young people, because I have some ideas about that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to clarify, I'm not at all suggesting it's not an important use of dollars. It's a timing issue of when we release it and whether that program is really ready relative to others and other resources that might become available.
Understood.
Mr. Bozovich.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll agree with Commissioner Burney. I actually felt the 3 million community grants was really an important piece of being responsive to the community's needs and a way of weighing projects that were getting individual requests to fund and balancing those rather than making a direct allocation from the board to a specific project. we've already granted Square One Villages $750,000 for Peace Village, and St. Vincent de Paul $500,000 for veterans housing. We set aside $1.5 million for us to do land acquisition for homeless in our prior spending of ARPA funds. You know, and we kind of jumped down into tier 4 in our last, you know, allocation. So I think, you know, pulling that from it would guarantee a no vote from me. I can hold my nose and support the current proposal because I can fully support the park's water system and sewer system needs, and I can look at that $3 million as one of the ways we're going to actually respond to the community's requests in a fair and measured manner. And I don't believe us amending for a single project request at this time balances that at all and doesn't give a fair competition for other needed projects to go after some of this funding. We've already made some very specific investments in projects through this funding already. And I think a competitive process for additional grants is a warranted way of allocating that money, not a direct allocation beyond what's already proposed in the 5 projects.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you. I got the same request all the rest of the commissioners did for Square One Villages, which I'm a huge fan of. I actually, when looking and comparing what we were going to be discussing today on item with the community grant making process, I thought that actually fit the bill for what people would be applying for that bucket of money for, and could be included. I mean, I don't know who else is interested in applying for various money. It sounds like different people have received different requests. So I do support this. I hear your concerns that maybe we need to ensure that when we go out for an RFP for this money that we have all our ducks in a row. And that absolutely should be done. And I'm hoping that Peace Village and others that have requested funding from us through the ARPA money will all be willing to apply. Thank you.
Commissioner Burney?
Chair, I'm ready to make a motion, and then I mean, maybe not right after, but would love to speak to it too. But
sure.
Is that okay? Maybe?
Well, I was going to ask staff. I'm looking. We don't have an order. I think you were looking for direction about moving forward.
We have an order.
I'm looking. Oh, sorry. I'm looking at the wrong agenda item on my. Thank you. No. It's not listed on the agenda as an order. It's listed as a discussion, but we do have the order in the packet. Is that right?
We do show an order.
There it is. Yeah. Well,
forgive me, Chair. I'm looking at and if I'm wrong, let me know. I'm looking at 13A and an order under that.
As am I, and I'm wondering if I maybe printed, because I'm using a hard copy for the agenda and an iPad for the materials. And on the materials I have, it doesn't have a completed order number. And on the agenda, it doesn't list an order at all. So Diana, can you confirm what the order number is?
Yep, I'm looking it up right now. One sec. I believe I updated the agenda.
Yeah.
I updated it on Saturday with the agenda number.
Diana, I do show the number on mine is 22-03-29-14.
You're stealing my thunder. That's the order I was going to propose.
Order number, yes.
Great, thank you. All right, go ahead, Commissioner Burney.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I would like to propose a motion to approve order 22-03-29-14 in the matter of allocating American Rescue Plan Act funding to propose projects and planning for future use of funds that align with Lane County's strategic priorities.
I'll second.
Been moved by Commissioner Burney and seconded by Commissioner Buck. Is there discussion to the motion? And Commissioner Burney mentioned he had comment.
Thank you, Chair. I would also like to ask staff, when they do have a proposed methodology for accepting applications for the community grants piece, because again, I really see this as a beta test, and how they're going to weight it, et cetera, that they present that in draft form for the board for approval. I would like us to be very engaged in that process, because I see that as being something, as I think was the intent of Chair Trieger, I see that as something that's going to receive more dollars and create a mechanism for our county to be strong advocates for our community partners moving forward. Thank you, Chair.
Any other discussion to the motion? And I'll just say I appreciate, I'm not opposed to what was presented by staff. I just wanted to offer an option of how we move forward. And to Commissioner Burney's point, it's my understanding, staff might bring something back, but they're also going to want some input from us around parameters and criteria and what that process, that grant making process looks like. So I would like to hear from staff if there's anything else you need from us on this agenda item before you can do that, or whether that will just come back as a separate piece, because there's no timeline attached to this. So we have time to work on the creation of the structure for that community grants program. Is there anything else you need that we could then discuss in under addressing the motion?
Chair Trieger, Commissioner Burney, commissioners, yes, thank you for the discussion. We will come back and return with that. We have already started working on a draft RFP. We want to be sure to include the equity lens, equity review on this as well. And if there are specifics that you are already aware of that you'd like us to include in advance, we can be sure to include those. We are thinking this as similar to the HIP process for those who've been around with the housing improvement plan, while looking at leveraging funds, gap funding, looking at any priorities from the board. We will come back and have that discussion with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, then, if there's no more discussion to the motion, I will ask for the vote. All those in favor of Order 22-03-29-14 made by Commissioner Buck and seconded by Commissioner Burney. Or do I have that reversed? I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Please signify by saying aye.
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 None opposed. Motion carries 4 in favor and 1 excused. Thank you very much to staff for all your work putting this together. Really appreciate it. The next item up is 14, Health and Human Services, and we are back on schedule. A discussion, status update on progress serving unhoused populations and initiatives at the county to do so with, I think, Kate Budd, Lisa Stewart are with us. And Steve, do you want to do anything by way of introduction of this item?
I think we can just turn it over to Kate, I believe is going to lead this discussion.
Good afternoon, Chair Trieger and commissioners. Really appreciate your time today. I know it's been a long one for you. I have the opportunity to introduce Lisa Stewart, our data analysis and HMIS supervisor, who is going to start with our presentation today. Lisa, please take it away.
Hi, thank you, Kate, and thanks, Chair and commissioners. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to show up my video while I present.
Right, and while you're getting that ready, I'll just remind folks, this is an information only, so unless there was something, since I printed out my agenda, there's no order or any vote to be taken on this item. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. So this afternoon, I'm going to provide an overview on the homeless system performance measures, which ask our community, have we improved outcomes for people experiencing homelessness? Is it rare, brief, and non-recurring? Oh, I'm not sure. Okay, there we go. So each year, The Human Services Division, in its capacity as the Continuum of Care lead, submits 2 system performance reports to HUD. The system performance refers to integrated services that make up the homeless system, not the software that we use to collect data, which is our homeless management information system that locally we use WellSky. Both reports are produced from data from our homeless management information system. The System Performance Report, or SPM, summarizes key performance indicators and provides us with an annual comparison. This report is based on all persons or individuals served. The Longitudinal System Analysis Upload, or the LSA, includes several of the same types of indicators, but looks at households, specifically the head of household. This report looks at how households are moving through our homeless system. The LSA are shared as Stellar Performance Visualizations, or Stella P. Because the logic on these 2 reports differs substantially, they're not comparable. And I will mention that the reason that with the longitudinal data that I'm talking about are data that we collect sequentially from the same respondents over time. And in this case, we collect data at the start, exit, and intervals in between for each client and every project enrollment. And we use that to track the trends and change. So Stella is an analysis tool created by HUD to help us and other continuums of care, or COCs, understand how our homeless services system is performing. It provides information that can be used to strategize local responses. There are 2 modules in Stella. The Stella Performance, or Stella P, uses dynamic visualizations of our community's longitudinal system analysis, LSA, to illustrate how households move through the system, and then it can also highlight outcome disparities. The second module, which is in development, it hasn't been released yet, will assist us in developing a vision of the system interventions and capacity needed to end homelessness. We'll be using the data on homelessness, combining combinations of project types and performance goals, and the system will help us calculate the inventory needed for an ideal crisis system response. And that can guide us to resource investment and decisions. So in this slide, I've illustrated the project types that make up the homeless services system in our homeless management information system. And these types are all defined by HUD. So in both reports, they include the emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing enrollments, and permanent supportive housing enrollments. A note on housed versus not housed on the status. Once a household is housed in a rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing project, they're no longer homeless. These households are, however, included in successful housing placement measures, which are part of the whole metric system that they give to us. The System Performance Measures report also includes street outreach in some of the measures. Neither report includes services only projects, homeless day access projects, or alternative shelters or coordinated entry. It's just not in there. That excluded project type alternative shelter is shown here in yellow on this slide. Alternative shelters are projects that do not meet the specific HUD standards for emergency shelter, but they are functioning as shelters in our community. They do not have their own project type, as the HUD hasn't created one yet. So we are required to code these as services only, which is why they're excluded. If we included alternative shelter in the performance report, it would help us better understand the role shelters play in our system. Shelter bed utilization has been on a bit of a roller coaster after the last few years. Last month, February 2022, 899, which is right over here on the left, by the way, 899 individuals stayed in one or more emergency or alternative shelters, with 337 staying in alternative shelters. Last year, in the midst of the pandemic, February 2021, 518 individuals stayed in either type of the shelter, with 120 staying in alternative shelters. And then 2 years ago, at the cusp of the pandemic, February 2020, 914 individuals stayed at a shelter, with 131 staying in alternative shelters. So there appears to be a rebound on shelter utilization, with a significant shift to alternative shelters. I'm going to go through the official system performance measures report very briefly, so you can see what is being measured and compared nationally with other continuums of care. In the first goal, goal 1A, people in emergency shelter or transitional housing projects did experience longer episodes of homelessness in prior years. In the second item, goal 1B, people from permanent housing projects were added to this universe. The number of days is much greater than 1A, but it's expected since many of the permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing projects get their referrals from coordinated entry. And the referrals are based in part on the length of time homeless. And compared to last year, however, this length of time dropped. In this slide, I am illustrating a comparison between the official version and what a local version would look like if I include alternative shelter, just to demonstrate this gap. In 2021, 385 people were excluded from the official version because they only stayed at alternative shelters. In 2020, 217 people were excluded. The length of time homeless is impacted by the excluded projects, as it shows fewer days in the local versus the official report. For example, the 456 versus the 378. The local version includes data on positive exit information from the alternative shelters, which in part explains this difference. The length of time homeless in these projects, in both the official and local versions, is quite long. And in 2019, we reported 121 median length of time homeless days for this very same measure. Both of these years that I have here, 2021 and 2020, were part of during the pandemic. And due to COVID safety measures, providers were encouraged to allow shelter guests to remain in the projects. That and a very low rental vacancy rate in the rental housing market and a low turnover rate in our permanent housing projects likely contributed to these lengthy stays. Another measure is returns to homelessness. Fewer people return to homelessness after previously exiting one of the homeless service projects included in this report and exiting into a permanent housing situation. Again, these returns do not include enrollments other project types would have identified, such as people returning through the door of day access or through the door of alternative shelters. The majority of people lose their housing and return to homelessness within 6 months of being rehoused. This information informs when the cycle, where in the cycle, continuing support or additional support is useful. So even though it is not a complete data set, it is still useful information. Another goal is the number of people experiencing homelessness overall. The idea is that we reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness, and what they use in goal 3.1 is the point in time survey. So this is one day each year, the last Wednesday of every January of the year. The number of people surveyed in January 2021 was greater than in prior years, but the PIT has, or the point in time count does have obvious limitations. So what we are using now is a homeless by name list to better understand homelessness in our community. The second goal here is the annual number. And again, this is only looking at these specific project types. Because we don't have enough emergency shelter, this number is really quite low for a year, whereas we know there are around 9,000 people a year who have experienced homelessness in our community. So of course, I'm going to take a look at our local data. So this date, these here is representing the number of people per year experiencing homelessness in Lane County based on our homeless by name list data. Instead of using a point in time, we are seeing a reduction in the total number of people experiencing homelessness in Lane County over the past 3 years. We now have enough years to call it a trend, just barely, and it is going in a good direction. The median number per month of people experiencing homelessness also shows a downward trend. The length of time homelessness information is not just for reporting. Outreach workers and other homeless services program staff are aware of the length of time for each client in the system, and the information can be used to understand what interventions in the past have and have not worked or been successful for that particular individual. Length of time homelessness is also used to prioritize persons on the central wait lists, so they will get referred to permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing projects. I do want to mention why we're using a median and rather than an average number for many of these counts. It's the HMIS data. It contains outliers, such as some individuals who've remained homeless for multiple years. So we use the median because otherwise the value of the mean would be dominated by these outliers rather than by typical values. So that is the choice, my reasoning on that.
And Lisa, just one quick question. I think we'll have a lot, but this is a lot of data and it's hard to track. The previous slide, the HMIS is more dialed into an individual and therefore is probably more useful than the PIT, right? I mean, a decrease in the number of the PIT year over year doesn't really tell us much except what happened on that one day each of those years, whereas this data is a little more useful.
That's so true. Thank you very much. Exactly. Back to the system performance measures. This is increased income is another metric we look at, but this metric is only for continuum of care funded projects. I'm really not sure why HUD limits that. The county has 14 active HUD continuum of care projects in HMIS right now. The percent of adults, which are we call leavers and stayers, in this, a leaver being somebody who exited and a stayer being someone who was still actively engaged on the last day of the report year, who increased their income was significantly lower in 2021 than in prior 3 years. This aligns with another national study because I was looking to see, is there anything else that resonates with this? There's a Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a CBPP, analysis of Census Bureau Pulse Survey tables show that among renters, looking at other folks in the community, those who are housed, that even among renters, with the recovery dollars and rent assistance, households remain impacted by pandemic and economy, particularly among BIPOC populations and other vulnerable populations. So it kind of holds true across the board that folks just have not been able to maintain or increase income through these last couple of years. Homelessness for the first time is another measure that we look at. The number was lower in 2021, but the report determines first-time homelessness from shelter stays only, and in that case, it's emergency shelter only. So because emergency shelter inventory remained reduced, and did not include alternative shelters or day access centers, the number this may be an artifact number of the fact that we are not reporting all the data in our own local system. This is more of HUD's version of what they consider a homeless system. Successful housing placements. The first one is for street outreach. People who are in street outreach who were successfully placed into housing. Street outreach continues to show improvement in this key performance indicator. The street outreach intervention has changed since we had the Tac Report and we've implemented coordinated outreach. And this illustrates that that intervention is having an impact on the number of people who are able to be housed. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Commissioner Burney. You're muted, sir. Commissioner Burney, you're muted.
I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to interrupt the presentation. It's just that data doesn't speak for itself. So some of these are in numbers and some are in percents. A consistent measure would be helpful for me. I'm really trying to follow. What are the numbers attached to these percents, if I might? And thank you, Chair.
That is a super good question. I will look that up when I wrap it up and make sure I put it in the chat for you. I'm sorry I don't have it right in front of me now.
Or maybe, I'm not sure if this is part of what you're getting at, Commissioner Burney, but what are the, in addition to the numbers, a percent, 16% of what number? The percentage of, when you say of people in street outreach, is that 16% of the people our staff contacted?
Thanks. So there are
permanent housing, is that what that means?
That's a great, street outreach in our community. We have, I think 9 street outreach projects. Some of them run through with Lane County contracts. Some of them do not. They're directly funded by their federal funding source, such as PATH through SAMHSA and Runaway and Homeless Youth through FSBE. So there are multiple, but this looks at all of those project types that are in our system. So what we're looking at is if the person was engaged with street outreach in any of the street outreach projects that are in our community, and they exited street outreach, of those people, how many exited to a permanent housing situation? Thank you. The second goal is looking at all the other project types, folks who are enrolled in emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, or permanent supportive housing. For these folks, the number of placements to permanent housing is significantly higher as well. So we jumped from 17% who exited to 29%. Again, this may be an artifact because we had significantly less emergency shelter. The projects had fewer people running through them continually. They had longer stays, and they may have been able to track the exit data better than in prior years where they had such a huge volume. A lot of times when people exit emergency shelter, we don't know where they went. All we know is they didn't come back another night. So it's not that we had an opportunity to do an interview with them upon exit. The other report I mentioned, the longitudinal system analysis. This is an upload that we submit to HUD, and they do magic and they report it back to us in what we call Stella. This report is the kind of information that planners and decision makers frequently request. But like the system performance measures, it is missing key data to show a complete picture. So HUD takes our vetted and approved data set and Stellavizes it, creating Stella visualizations into an interactive dashboard. Stellavization is the process of preparing all our data, verifying that the data quality meets the necessary standards, and running it through the tool, resulting in the visualizations. Street outreach, day access centers, alternative shelters, again, they are not included in this report. That said, Stella is a great example of system mapping. I'm sure this is very tiny, but I'll try to walk you through it. Here's an example of one of our 2021 system maps in Stella Performance. Households use different combinations of project types during the time they're served in the homeless system. These project type combinations are referred to as pathways. Each pathway has a different average cumulative days homeless, exits to permanent housing, and returns to the homeless system. So we can see how long people remain homeless at specific junctures in the system. The system map shows performance for the included project types in the homeless system, and it can be filtered to show performance for the main pathways and populations, such as adult-only households or veteran households, long-term homelessness, or unaccompanied or parenting youth. I'll just walk through this one top route. Here on this one that starts with 76%. I know it's tiny, but I'll read it. This is one of the pathways This pathway is for folks who enrolled in emergency shelter and here exited from emergency shelter. So 76% of all the households in this data set followed this pathway. The folks on this pathway were homeless an average of 149 days. 12% of these folks staying on this pathway exited to permanent housing situations. 4%, these folks right here, moved on to transitional housing, and all the folks in transitional housing had a 41% of them exited to permanent housing. These folks right here, 6%, they moved from emergency shelter to permanent supportive housing. And of all the people in permanent supportive housing, 30% exited permanent supportive housing into another permanent housing destination. Usually that would be with a Section 8 voucher, affordable housing, or rental on their own. And finally, this 8% right here, these folks moved from emergency shelter to rapid rehousing. And of these rapid rehoused folks, 68% exited the project into a permanent destination. So here we show the filter for just households with children. And the data, really, they look quite different from one population to another. So let me show you a comparison of a couple household types. These are too tiny to read, I understand that, but here are the data below that plug into the little graph above. So what I'm doing here is I'm comparing households with children in the system to adult-only households. Adult-only households are households that everyone is over 18. It's usually a single, sometimes it's a couple, and on very rare occasion, it's a household with children who are also over 18. Households with children are folks that there's at least one adult 18 or over and at least one child less than 18 years old. So what we see here is fewer households with children experience homelessness in our community. Households with children are homeless 150 days on average versus 227 days for adult-only households. Our system successfully rehouses a higher percent of households with children than adult-only households, regardless of the pathway. And more people in adult-only households return to homelessness. So the takeaway from this is that interventions that work well for one population may not be as successful for another population, which is why we try to focus on those population groups and other types of demographics when we're building successful projects or reviewing their effectiveness. What we don't see in the Stella system mapping are the people who entered through a day access center, alternative shelter, street outreach, or coordinated entry. If we did, the 232,334 households would be the households comprised of the 8,492 people on our homeless by name list. And that is our goal this summer when we are fully staffed. Our first goal is to upload a local non-official LSA data set up into the HUD to Stellavise that includes our alternative shelter projects along with the emergency shelter. This will be a good start that can be used locally by local policy and decision makers to identify the pain points and strategize ways to improve the system. There's no way to include other missing project types in Stella at this time, so we'll need to build a local model. It did take HUD 7 years to create Stella, so hopefully folks can be patient as we make this progress. This type of modeling is a heavy lift, but by using models that HUD already developed, the data team plans to build a local version that includes all our homeless project types within the next 2 to 3 years, depending on successful staff development and retention. And regarding these goals and staffing levels, I do want to take a few seconds to sincerely thank county leadership, specifically Steve Manella and the Board of County Commissioners, for advocating and approving additional positions for the data and analytics team. We did just finish interviewing candidates for one position, We're posting another data and quality analyst position to advance our work on these project types for modeling and reporting. We'll also be rehiring 2 additional administrative analysts, one to assist data quality and training, and the other one to work exclusively with a new YHDP grant, which is the Youth Homeless Demonstration Project grant. Lane County has made great strides in data-driven decision-making, and it has outpaced the analysts who are trying to provide the data to you. So hopefully by next fall, we'll be in a better position to respond to data requests and create more online visualization and tools for the seekers of this information. So I know that was just a lot of information, so I'm leaving you with some resources that can dive into some of the topics that I have here. I really appreciate your time. I will be providing the official reports that I show in this presentation to the board members later this week, as well as a copy of the presentation, and these links will be in that. And I will be, after the full presentation, I will stay online and be available for any questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Kate, are you up next?
I am, yes. I will swap the slides. All right. I am hoping you can see a slide that says homelessness update. Is that correct?
I just see my own thumbnail, but it's very big.
Chair, I was enjoying seeing 2 of you.
I'm seeing whoever the speaker is.
Do you want to send your presentation? Oh. There we go.
Oh, are you able to see? Okay.
Yeah, we can see the preview on the side and your main slide in the center of the screen.
Okay.
I know we've been having this problem all day where some people have had to convert to a PDF. There we go. There you go.
All right. Thank you for your patience. My name is Kate Budd, and I serve as the housing manager with Lane County Health and Human Services and the Human Services and Housing Division. As you may know, I am rather new in my position. I've just recently hit about 4 months. And so I am certainly in the learning phase, but really pleased to share with you a few of the things that I think might be relevant that I have learned recently. My presentation will include sharing a bit about funding that we have contracted out in the community to local agencies, talking about COVID-related funding that we are utilizing to both serve people who are houseless as well as those who are in need of rent assistance in order to remain stable in their housing. We'll also look at COVID motels that are serving people who are at high risk of COVID. And I'll share with you some of the options that myself and my team are mulling over right now. And then lastly, to take a look at the Tac Report recommendations and to share with you a few key updates that we have been working on in the last few months. So this is a chart regarding specific contracts that are provided to local nonprofits to serve people who are houseless. Regarding these contracts, they do not include funding that's used internally. So it does not include funding for our HMIS staff or for our coordinated entry staff. It also doesn't include any of the ARPA related funds that this body has provided to Housing and Human Services or the state has provided, in that we're still working through all the contracting details. And lastly, it doesn't include rent assistance for people who are currently housed, because those folks, fortunately at this point, are not houseless. And so if someone were to ask me, how much money do we have contracted today in our community? It's approximately $14 million. And one thing that I often look at when someone shares with me the amount of money that's allocated is, what are the priorities that are being funded? And often the funding indicates to me what those priorities are. So looking at this chart, we have emergency shelters receiving the greatest allocation of funding at this point. That makes a lot of sense because we know that there was a need for additional emergency shelters throughout COVID so that people had a chance to be able to quarantine and isolate in a safe space. The second highest allocation of funding is with permanent supported housing. And that is a model that serves people with the highest needs who are literally most vulnerable on the streets and utilizes the most systems of care. And so that is very much aligned with our strategic plans through the Poverty and Homelessness Board. Thirdly, we have outreach, which focuses on just connecting folks who are on the street with resources. And fourthly, rapid rehousing, which is a program that moves people who are houseless into permanent housing through rent assistance and case management. And so from even an outside perspective, it's nice to be able to see, where are the dollars going and what are the priorities for Lane County Housing and Human Services. We're also fortunate, thanks to all of you commissioners, to have received approximately $11 million in ARPA funds. Those are to be used over the next 3.5 to 4 years and will be used for either current programming that we have now or to help fulfill Tact recommendations that we are currently working on. So we had 4 key categories where funding was allocated. And we are excited to be able to move this funding forward, such as with the Brooklyn Street Shelter, which we expect to be opening within the next few months. White Bird Outreach, which focuses on the city of Eugene, which has started already. And then continuing to work on providing capacity building support for nonprofits. And working with other entities within our community that are also providing capacity building support so that we can leverage the overall supports being provided. And then lastly, with permanent supported housing, we have MLK Commons that is currently open, and the Nell, which will be opening sometime in the summer or fall to be able to serve an additional 40 individuals with permanent supported housing. We were also fortunate to receive approximately $3 million that will be used again over a 3.5 period for some very specific costs. One that we have been celebrating here in our department recently is the Landlord Engagement Program. And the celebration is because we brought a staff member on about 3 weeks ago, and they have been amazing in making connections right out of the gate, starting to talk to landlords, and also bring together the many different landlord liaison roles that currently exist within our partner agencies in the community, so that everyone is working together and that they have an opportunity to learn peer-to-peer from one another. We also receive funding for land acquisition for pallet shelters in Springfield, money for pallet shelters themselves, a little bit more money for nonprofit capacity building, and then funding to continue with the rehabilitation of the Brooklyn Street Shelter. Early on in COVID, we received emergency solutions grant funding for COVID from the federal government via Oregon Housing and Community Services. And we had approximately 1.5 years to spend those funds out, and it went quickly. We are facing an end date for the ESG funding of September 30. And so as a result, we are working on continuing outreach programs and emergency shelters that are currently funded with ESG to transition them over to other funding. We are going to potentially be realizing some gaps as these ESG funds go away. And they include being able to provide supportive services to the residents in safe sleep sites that have been created by the city of Eugene, as well as rent assistance for people who are at risk of homelessness. And then also the specific COVID shelters that were created early on in the COVID days. Those are kind of waning in the dollars that are available to support them. And so we're looking to see how we might be able to continue for as long as possible. So speaking a bit more regarding those COVID shelters that the county created early on in COVID in order to address the needs of people who are houseless and needing to quarantine and isolate. There were 4 new shelters that were created for that purpose. They include Garden Spot through Carry It Forward, an emergency shelter through Shelter Care, and then 2 motels that were master leased also for that same purpose. All of these current shelters are open at this point, and we continue to explore how we might be able to keep them open for as long as possible. One other motel that was actually purchased by Lane County that is important to talk about is the former Red Lion, which is now called Bridges on Broadway. This shelter was purchased solely for the purpose of housing wildfire survivors. And it has been doing that now for months, in fact, almost a year. And we are seeing the numbers of wildfire survivors wane in that we've been receiving referrals from the state and they haven't been sending referrals because they don't have people to send. And so we're seeing today that there are a few rooms that are opening up that remain vacant. And so we are planning on starting in June of 2022, moving guests from Motel 66 and University Inn who have significant health challenges or are seniors in age into the open spaces at Bridges on Broadway. And so we're glad that we can provide additional shelter time for some of the folks in the COVID motels. To look at this from a different perspective, we have a timeline where you can see that the University Inn right now is going to be open through June 30 of 2022. And this is actually our most costly COVID motel. And so that is one that due to funding, we're going to need to work on closing that motel. The other motel that has funding just through June 30 is Motel 66. Now, this one is a less expensive motel. And so we are focusing on whether we might have dollars to extend the closing date of Motel 66 through September 30 right now. And so we're working on seeing if that might be a possibility. I mentioned Bridges on Broadway, and we are very much working to allocate funding to keep Bridges on Broadway open, both for the wildfire survivors as well as the new guests from the University Inn in Motel 66. So we're looking for dollars for Motel 66 to extend to September 30 and beyond, for Bridges on Broadway to extend to beyond June 1. And then we have a gap where we're not in any position right now to be able to say that we can keep Bridges on Broadway open between June 30 and fall of 2024. So this is really just informational to share with you that these are the challenges that we're working through. These are more specifically some of the challenges or options that we are talking about. Again, if we should look at, the first option of just closing the fewest motels on June 30, which would mean we want to focus on extending Motel 66 as well as Bridges on Broadway. Or we look at option C, which option B must have been a bad one because it's gone. But option C, that we would close Motel 66 and University Inn on June 30 and then utilize funds elsewhere, potentially helping to bridge that Bridges on Broadway gap or other emergency shelter options that folks from those two motels, Motel 66 and University Inn, could transition into. And then lastly, just continuing to look for funding to extend to Motel 66. And so certainly looking at ARPA dollars is an option, looking at how the state might be able to support some of these efforts. And then of course, other funding for homelessness services that we might be able to utilize. So I'm going to shift gears now and talk a bit about the Tac Report. And you may recall that the Tac Report had 10 recommendations that had a number of goals within each recommendation. And what is impressive to me when I arrived is that a great deal of progress has been made in moving these Tac recommendations forward. And so the next slides help to share where we are with each recommendation through color coding. And so you have recommendation number 1, expanding diversion and rapid exit services, which is basically trying to engage with people who have been homeless for a short period of time, to have targeted conversations, help them explore, who within their network, within their strengths might be able to help them become rehoused. And if a small amount of financial assistance might help rehouse them and get them off the street. Diversion is a model that is being used across the country and very much has been adopted by the Veteran Affairs Administration through their veteran homelessness work. And so we're continuing to grow this model here locally. But we have this goal highlighted in green because it's one that continues to be in progress, but we're making very good strides. We already have funds that are for diversion and rapid response, which is kind of a synonymous term with diversion. And we're looking to increase the amount of money that can help provide diversion moving forward. So with the second recommendation, this is adding low barrier shelter. And of course, the Navigation Center is our primary focus here. It continues to move forward. The request for proposal for the Navigation Center was due on Friday. And I'm really pleased to report that we got 3 responses from that proposal. And so that's exciting considering the last one, we didn't get any. So we have strong proposals to work through the process with. Regarding the third goal, increasing the effectiveness of coordinated entry, we have been able to provide navigation services to the City of Eugene Safe Sleep sites, which we hope will help move individuals beyond the emergency shelter and into housing. We're excited about that. Regarding coordinated outreach, we have some positive additions to our outreach teams. One being through Whitebird, which is focused on the city of Eugene, and the second being an additional Lane County staff member who will be focusing on our outreach across the county. So with goal number 6, we had a few items that actually hadn't started until just recently. And these are both connected to the landlord liaison role that I mentioned earlier. And the staff member who's in this role has already started by name landlord list and has spoke with many landlords already to understand, what might work well for them, as well as what might work well for the agencies who are working on housing people. And then also working on what would an engagement strategy to help educate landlords as well as the housing programs look like, so that everyone is speaking the same language and that we as a homelessness system are presenting people to landlords who are well equipped to be strong tenants. Regarding goal number 7, this one is really around how can we diversify funding within our agencies to be done, like stabilizing people in housing can be paid for. And one development is through the statewide effort to get an 1115 Medicaid waiver approved. What this will do is it will allow for agencies who bill Medicaid to be able to bill for housing supports or even employment supports. And this was something that was a bit of a game changer in Washington state. And so if it's able to move forward, and I know there's a lot of people at the statewide level working on it, it will be beneficial here in our community. Regarding number 8, staff through the Poverty and Homelessness Board in collaboration with committee members created a rapid rehousing standard tool in order to help equip the many rapid rehousing programs we have with the same expectations. And that's a best practice. And we certainly appreciate the agencies as well as the community members who are part of that process. And then lastly, increasing permanent supported housing. And that's one where we've made significant progress and continue to do so, especially knowing that the NEL will be opening later on this summer or in the fall. And then we also have Bridges on Broadway that currently is a motel, but come 2024 will be rehabilitated to be a permanent supported housing facility for individuals. So we'll continue to see the number of permanent supported housing programs increase. So that's everything I wanted to share with you. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Kate. It's a lot of information, a lot of data, a big problem, an important problem to be talking about homelessness. And we do still have a few minutes on the agenda for this item. So commissioners, if you have questions, comments, feedback for staff, now's the time. Commissioner Buck.
I have a question on the hotels. That looks like 2 of the hotels that we provide for folks are going to be closing. And I know that you're working really hard to extend one for a few more months. And then other potential housing, but I have to say it looks pretty bleak. And it's my understanding, and please clarify this if I don't understand this correctly, but those folks that are housed in those hotels are extremely vulnerable populations, elderly, disabled, with severe medical issues. And we won't have a place for them to be at the end of June. This really concerns me. And I know that the funding is simply running out. But it also is potentially deadly to put these people that are in such poor medical shape on the street. I don't know what else there is that we can say at this point. I'm hoping there's other alternatives on the horizon.
Staff have a response to that, or Kate? We seem to.
Sure. I appreciate your point, Commissioner Black, and the fact is that we wouldn't want to see any of these people go back to the street. I'm sorry, are you able to hear me?
We can hear you. We lost a visual on you, but we can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, so as a result of that, we very much are exploring all options that exist. You know, the final option being, how can we transition folks who are in the motels into shelters that we do have in the community, to make sure that they're not transitioning to the street. We are looking for those who are moving from the University Inn as well as Motel 66 into the bridges on Broadway, looking to triage folks to ensure that those with the highest level of needs are moving into a motel-like environment. But to your point, we're really triaging, you know, those who have the highest level from those who have, you know, a medium level. And so it does propose a number of challenges that we're really working on being thoughtful about, both within our team, with the provider who is running the motels, as well as our community as a whole.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Burney.
Thank you, Chair. I'm prepared for some of my marks to be well received and perhaps some not to be. First, let's start with the good ones. First, is there anything I can do to help you find pallet shelter sites in Springfield? And how many are you looking for? Anyone?
Commissioner Burney, that's a great question. And I'd be glad to get back to you.
I'm sorry.
I want to make sure that I check in with my staff to make sure that it's well aligned with what they're needing and planning at this point.
Okay. Although, okay. Motel 66. I heard, and maybe I heard incorrectly, that there's going to be another round of hotel purchases where locals are going to get money from the state. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well, that there's another round of turnkey funding.
So what are we doing to buy the damn thing?
I think that's a great question. We're working to learn more about what the timeline is and what the options look like, but it's a very good question.
Okay, if I may, forgive me, I'm just almost losing my shoes here because it's been a long presentation. I want to get to what we can do. It seems to me that right now, the reason Motel 66 is in business is they probably have a pretty sweet contract with us for rooms for these people. I would like to know right now, not from you right now, but I think we ought to pursue right now what it would look like to them and whether or not they're amenable to a purchase, even before we know whether there's dollars available. I remember the last time that this program came through, we were told there were no hotels in Lane County. I personally intervened below the radar, and we had an incredible staff that could carry it. But I think that's a big deal. So, you know, for what it's worth, I would request that. And forgive me, this is hard for me. I'm delighted to be part of a board that has people that have been in the space you're in now. In my old job, I created jobs so people could afford this without government service. And now I feel like I'm kind of in the business of there's this entire underclass, the biggest home crisis shortage in the history of the United States, according to an article I just read. So many changes. So what's the big deal about a landlord engagement strategy? I mean, we're just trying to get as many landlords as possible, or people with extra rooms as possible, and develop incentives and for them to rent to people that are unhoused, correct?
It is. And another piece of the strategy is to create a list that will help someone who may have a criminal background, for example, know which landlords might be second chance landlords, as we have referred to them, so that they can go there and say, you know, I've experienced this felony and I, you know, have changed my life significantly in the past 6 years and it's been holding me back. You know, can I tell you more?
Well, it sounds like part of your strategy then is just surveying various people. And I would, to what I know, I would include the home share program because we don't have to build those units. And just identify what kind of people they're willing to rent to. Is that part of the strategy you're talking about?
It is, yes.
And so what would be the goals of that strategy? 1,000 new beds from existing landlords with an understanding of how many could be slotted for what types of people?
That would be an example of a goal, yes.
Okay, I think you can tell by my questions that I'm itching to do things. There's a part of me, and here's the thing where I think most people disagree with me. There's a part of me that wish we could take all the resources that are gathering data, put them on the side, do things to find places for people, and then in 2 or 3 years, measure how good we did. I know that's incredibly simplistic. I know we need to understand nuances of populations, but this problem is so huge. One of the things that was hard for me to deal with when we heard earlier on our agenda, the discussion about the $422 million grant for people who've lost their homes during the fires, was the length of time this process is going to take. And we're already 1.5 years into it. And it's hard for me not to think of the people whose lives have been uprooted and are living this right now, currently, and who we tend to forget. And now so as we go through these processes, forgive me, I have a real bias for action, and that's what's behind the questions, not a lack of support for what we're doing. Thank you, Chair. Forgive the outburst.
Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you, Chair. First, I want to say, thank you for all the data on overall system performance. And if I could ask that Kate and Lisa supply their slide presentations to the entire board. Way too much to digest as the slides were flipping by. So I'd like to be able to go back and look at those more slowly. Now, at least I have the brief overview, and now I can go back and look in detail, knowing some of the explanations of what the data means. It seems to me that, we've got a certain amount of data we're tracking on outcomes based on what HUD defines as certain performances and what HUD will allow us to include in data and all that. So we're missing big pieces of this system. And it's more of an overall system performance, not a program or particular contractor's performance in the system. So one of the things I would like to try and encourage is, as we are writing new contracts to nonprofits and service providers, that there be a data requirement, where they do track exit, how people exit as much as possible so we get better data. But also, a lot of these contracts are being written paying per bed per night or something like that, whether it's a safe sleep site or temporary dusk to dawn situation. They're being written on head count, not outcome. somehow or another. And if there's some way of trying to get outcome performance-based contracting written into some of this, I don't know how. I just would love to be able to go, you know what, the mass tent dawn to dusk is working really well on getting people to exit into permanent housing and getting them connected with services, but letting people camp in their own campers in a parking lot is having a horrible performance in that. We ought to be concentrating our money on more dawn to dusk type beds versus more parking spaces for campers. That's kind of what I would like to be able to understand, is where we should be investing these millions of dollars we're spending to the greatest benefit of the population we're trying to benefit. So that's kind of where I all this brings that up for me. But I can't tell you how much I appreciate the presentation, the connections with the modeling that were done, and the system longitudinal system look that came out of some of the data, the Stella data. I can't wait to look at that with more time. And I think you guys are doing a lot of yeoman's work. Limited staff. I know it's a very difficult system, a lot of stressors on it, from the fire victims to the COVID situation. Everything seems to change almost on a daily basis for you guys in the playing field. But it does look like we are maybe making some progress from the data we have. So that's always a good thing to look at. I still am dying to get enough good data to say, you know what, we really should maybe think about discontinuing this program and concentrating dollars in that one because it's more effective. And I just don't see us having that kind of ability to say that right now.
Thank you. Well, looking at the time, I'll just wrap up by saying many of the points that were made before me by my colleagues, I echo. I also was curious about whether the Motel 66 would be a potential property for Project Turnkey. Was also curious about more pallet shelters in Springfield and other communities outside of Eugene, because this, the concentration of services in Eugene was reflected in the report. But maybe at our next report, we could break down the presentation and talk about how we're providing services geographically and what that looks like across the county, both the numbers that represent the need and also what our programs are that exist in other parts of the county outside of Eugene. I also really appreciated the example Commissioner Burney gave, like about the individual units and home share and setting goal numbers and saying how close are we to that number. And I do appreciate what Commissioner Bozovich just mentioned about how do we know what the investment is yielding. I mean, I personally think a person who gets to sleep somewhere where they can lock their valuables and personal belongings away safely for the night and they're sheltered from the elements is a positive outcome, night by night by night, but it is a very expensive way of addressing the need. And so I think maybe somewhere in between, is that the best investment based on what we're getting for the dollars versus longer term solution is another way to look at it. But that is the challenge of the time we're in, right? Is the humanitarian crisis of each individual night that a person experiences sleeping rough versus investing the money in something longer term. I did really especially appreciate the graph, the sort of flow chart with the purple and the arrows that showed of this group, here's how many eventually. That was to me sort of the most useful at a grasp of just how we're doing and how many people are moving through the system and where they end up landing. The only other piece I would like to hear the next time we get a report that we didn't hear anything about is internally, what are our systems? Where are bottlenecks in our systems or in how we work with partners that could use some systems improvements? So for example, I know our central wait list, it's pretty clunky the way that that it operates. And I know some of that we inherit as regulations from the funders from HUD, but that when a unit frees up, it can sometimes take way too long to fill it because of that process or helping that person who's on the wait list get their documents and so on. So it seems like there undoubtedly are some internal systems improvements or ways that we work with our partners and other parts of the system that could help streamline and move people through a little faster and get them a better result. So maybe we can think about structuring the report next time from that, the sort of the geography of the county, the internal systems and partnerships, and then the external landscape, and then seeing the funding pieces. That pie chart was really helpful too. So thank you, staff. Any final comments from staff before we move on? Okay, thank you so much. It has been a long day and we're in the home stretch. So we are on item 15, Commissioner's Business. Is County Administrator with us? There we go.
I'm here.
All right. So Commissioners, any announcements from the board? Seeing none, future board assignment requests. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you, Chair. I guess this is the point where we have a little bit more detailed discussion about future meetings and meeting locations and in-person versus waiting till Harris Hall is available. You know, and for me, it's not just a concern about board meetings. We're coming into budget season and having the first budget committee meeting basically is a public hearing. And then our last one's a public hearing also, and being able to do those where people can attend in person. The last one, Harris Hall, ought to be open. And I understand there's logistics issues and everything else. I know that multiple agencies around this area meet in non-normal rooms and have Metro TV broadcast. I am willing to take whatever remainder is in my current office budget and contribute it to the cost of Metro TV having to come off site somewhere to broadcast us if necessary or set up the logistics. I also know that the commissioners have a contingency fund in our budget. I feel it's so important for us to keep our integrity with the public to get to in-person meetings. I mean, I'm personally not looking forward to having to drive into town at $4.89 a gallon. But this is important to me. And I'm just hoping that, you know, if I can get agreement with the board to ask the administrator to look into, you know, if there's some way we could start sooner than the third week of May with some kind of in-person capabilities, I would greatly appreciate it, and particularly when it comes to our budget committee.
Thank you, Commissioner Bozovich. I'm very curious to know, you know, as someone who has worked for many, many years and done a lot of organizing and lobbying in Salem, for years we were very frustrated that the general public couldn't provide testimony remotely, particularly related to a lot of the issues I was working on. It was very hard for people to get to Salem, and legislators wanted to hear from people all over the state. They wanted people to come from Bend to give 3 minutes of public testimony on why it was hard for them to take an hour off without pay to take their kid to the doctor. It didn't make sense. So here we are in this environment where we are actually making our meetings far more accessible to the general public with just a phone line or an internet connection. And I am very much looking forward to getting back to Harris Hall. It's been a long time. I'm very curious what you see as so much of an advantage that it is a difference if we wait another month plus.
So personally for me, we're hearing from the public, but we're only hearing their voice. And so much of communication is nonverbal. Body posture, facial expression, you know, ask any communication specialist about it and they'll tell you that. Having those folks be able to stand in front of us and give their public testimony where they also see our facial expressions and body postures in the moment rather than trying to look between 5 separate screens, rather than seeing us all together on a dais or at a conference table. I think it allows for much more in-person, interaction between that testimony to the board and the board's response. There'll be people, I think, that'll still prefer the virtual option. And I agree with you. I've driven to Salem, the hour and 10 minutes or whatever it is to give my 3 minutes of testimony more than once. And it would have been great to be able to do some of that virtual. And there may be people that will, continue to enjoy the virtual interaction with the board. We used to take board meetings to Florence on a regular basis, and we've gone down to Cottage Grove. We've held them in Oak Ridge. We managed to do that in the past. It seems to me we've met outside of Harris Hall before.
I don't think what's being discussed is whether or not to return to in-person meetings. It's simply a timing issue. And so are there any other board members that want to comment before we hear from our administrator on this topic?
Sure.
Commissioner Burney?
I'd like to comment. I think we've heard multiple times by the same 5 people that obviously aren't working, or at least they've been able to take enough time out of their workday. I think this morning we heard a couple of them say they weren't, and very emotional, right? And I get the optics of it. I really do. For example, the Springfield City Council, some Springfield City Councilors come in, they're hybrid, and some don't. They don't have members of the public in, so it's just everybody's kind of figuring out, resettling into something. I have no problem asking the administrator what's out there and what's available and what's possible, but by the same token, the double irony, right? I mean, yes, we all are probably going out and having meetings. I know I am, with large groups, with small groups, and yet on our Board of Commissioners meetings, we're doing it this way. And yet, honestly, I know of no other way to make it more available for the public. So I get it both ways. And I certainly don't have a problem asking Steve, what's available and what's realistic or what's not, and what's the cost benefit attached to it.
Commissioner Buck?
I also would love to be in person, and knowing that our conference room isn't big enough, but it can do hybrid meetings. Yeah. I think there's also a lot to be said for just having the commissioners all in one room and also reading each other's body language and talking in person again. There's a lot to say for that. It's part of how we work together. It's not ideal for the public to join in that tight room. I feel like the public would still most likely have to be online to watch us, unless one at a time came in to do their public comment, which maybe that's what we try until we can all be in the larger room. There's an expense to this. So I'm totally open to asking our administrator to look into it and give us some options and costs. But I'm kind of leaning towards, maybe this medium place where we know we have the infrastructure, won't cost us any more, where we could still potentially have one person at a time, or maybe 2 people at a time. I don't really know what the space constraint will be, and also be able to allow a hybrid. But I would agree. I'll support it, but very curious what options are really truly available to us.
That don't cost more than the remaining of Commissioner Bozovich's budget. No, I'm just kidding.
You want me to respond, Chair?
Please.
So the best solution to this, if the board would like to meet in person prior to the 3rd week in May, which is when Harris Hall at this stage we're being told will be available to us, would be to meet in the BCC, because the BCC room is already, it's the other, I mentioned that earlier, it's the 1 floor above Harris Hall. It's the floor that I'm on and Commissioner Trieger is on right now. And it has a large conference table. It's not, it's much smaller than Harris Hall, but it is set up with the audio video equipment that it would allow for broadcast on television, as well as the webcasting that we do. So that would be my recommendation to you. We are planning, our budget team has been meeting and discussing options related to the budget committee. And what we've tentatively planned is that we'd like to have the budget committee meetings in person. Our plan was to have the kickoff on the evening of May 3rd virtually, because there's so many people that typically participate in that, and staff and members of the public that attend that. So we were planning to have the budget kickoff virtually, but then to have each of the budget committee meetings with the budget committee and the presentations you'll receive from departments in person in the BCC. So then my suggestion would be to give us a few weeks to prepare that so that we can make sure that we still have a hybrid setup. So people are, we have that room, that BCC room set up so that we can do the hybrid, receive calls from folks virtually, as well as take testimony in person, and set up an overflow room if in the event that we get a lot of people that come in person, you don't have everyone crammed in that small room. So there's some logistics, but I think certainly we could be set up if that's what the board would like to do. We could certainly be set up by later in April to do that, which gives you, probably 3 or 4 board meetings before Harris Hall is available.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll just note that the third week of May, which is the anticipated time, is a down week for us already. May 17th is down. So best case scenario, if everything's completed, in fact, by the third week of May, would be the 24th, and then we're down the week after that. So we would have one meeting and then be down again, and then we'd be into June. And I would be curious to know, and I see Commissioner Burney wants to speak. I would be really curious to know. You said they need to complete the work, and then there's cleanup. Cleanup shouldn't be delayed, but completing the work, is there still, supplies, equipment, materials that we're waiting on that could be delayed? Basically, how much of the timeline of the project is still out of our hands versus we can anticipate a little more cleanly?
I need to check on that to know specifically. I think, as was discussed earlier, the timeline has already been pushed out. So we were anticipating that we would have access to Harris Hall in April, in early to mid-April, and it's now the third week in May. And so my expectation is that we need to be in there. And, the board has desired to be back in person. Our staff wants to get back in person for these board meetings and move forward with that. So my expectation is it will be the third week of May, but I'll certainly double check to make sure that we expect and we let our contractors know that we need to have access to that room for in-person board meetings by then.
Great. And from a noticing perspective, advance time is just the week that the materials are posted. Is that right? Or is there more noticing?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Burney, did you have a comment?
Yes, it's late in the day and I'm forgetting this is still a public meeting. I was going to start calling everyone by their first name. No, but so Commissioner Bozovich, I think we're moving in the direction that you were hoping. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah, I think that's reasonable, Steve.
Okay.
So I'll work with Ms. Jones, and we'll certainly bring this to our agenda team meeting again next Tuesday to discuss that and talk about logistics. But understanding that the board's desire is we'll get an in-person hybrid style meeting set up as soon as possible, with certainly the goal of I think it's the third meeting in April. That we have, and report back to you. So hopefully we'll be able to report back to you either next week or the week after to confirm what that will look like. And again, with the idea that we'll work towards making that happen in the Public Services Building, in the BCC conference room on the second floor.
And I think we should have a card or something for Commissioner Trieger, because this is going to be her first meeting with all of us.
So that was sort of a combination of future board assignment request and a review of that assignment. But are there any other assignment requests from the board? All right. Steve, do you want to review that assignment? Or
I think we'll add that. I think we'll just add that as an assignment so that the board can track it. You've talked about it, but it's clearly a desire to get that going. And so we'll add what I just recapped with having an in-person board meeting starting by the third meeting in April.
Great, thank you. And I'll just note, it's an old assignment back in the earlier, but not the before times. We talked about returning to Harris Hall, and I had made a request that we make some amount of ceremony and honoring of it, of the return to, and an acknowledgement of all that's transpired in the 2 years that we weren't able to meet in person. And so that is still an open assignment, and I'm happy to talk offline and think through that with you, Steve, or Devin, or whoever the right person on staff is. But to my mind, that really is about when we are fully back in Harris Hall as an ongoing matter of course, not simply that we are meeting in person. So just wanted to note that, because I won't be here next week for agenda setting or for our board meeting if there's more discussion on this item.
I believe we were trying to get in person in July or August of last year, yep. And then Delta hit, and then Omicron hit, and then we had this construction work happen. So it's we're all excited to make that happen.
Exactly. Great. Thanks.
I will never forget being advised by our public health staff as chair and making this big announcement that this thing is in the rearview mirror. Mm-hmm. It's behind us. We can get back to normal. And here we are. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Commissioner Trieger.
Yep. What's behind us is in fact behind us. We just don't know what's still in front of us, right? Right. Is there any other business for the good of the order? All right, then. Thank you. It's been a long day. Thank you to staff, and as always to Diana and to all of you. And we will, well, I won't see you next week, but you will all see you on another. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you.